So I am a cognitive neuroscientist by training, and I'm really interested in the question of the relationship between language and thought. Are humans special? Do they think differently because they have language? What role does language play in helping us carry out our everyday cognitive processes? And so it turns out that the questions that are so relevant for humans are also now relevant for AI. And we can start asking the questions about the relationship between language and other cognitive abilities in large language models. And in fact, with the rise of models that are now pretty powerful, we see lots and lots of work in the domain of so-called AI psychology, where people take language models and they don't necessarily study them for their language abilities, but they study them in terms of their ability to do various cognitive tasks. So we see research in working memory capacity of language models, reasoning, theory of mind, so social cognition, creativity. Some people even go ahead and test personality traits in these models, like extroversion. The questions that are relevant for societal impact are questions of morality. Can we even talk about morality in these models? And of course, their ability to deceive and manipulate humans to achieve maybe some other goals. So as you see, this kind of landscape is very laden with cognitive terms, with terms that are all about cognitive behaviors. And even though this large body of work is very new, the idea is perhaps not. It's very convenient to take these tests, this personality test, cognitive abilities tests, and give them the language models precisely because they take in language. And so this very old cognitive test, the Turing test, was using the same kind of paradigm where you have an observer interacting with a human or a machine through a language interface. And so you are using language to probe the underlying cognitive capabilities. In the context of a Turing test, it's testing knowledge, humor, whatever you want to figure out whether it's a computer or not. But broadly speaking, the idea of using language to probe underlying cognitive capacities is very powerful and very well established. And it makes sense. Language evolved to help us exchange thoughts with one another. If I want to know what's going on in your head, the easiest thing for me to do is to ask. But there is a danger here where language and thinking might end up being conflated because they're used together so much. And you can have this kind of conflation in humans. If you are listening to a speaker who is very powerful, very persuasive, very fluent, you might be tempted to believe them, even if their words are maybe, a little vacuous. Similarly, with language models, because they use language to communicate with us, we tend to automatically ascribe to them cognitive capabilities that like we would expect from another human, but that might or might not be the case. So this illusion is very powerful of cognition behind the language interface. And so we need to be really careful and really precise when we're trying to actually go ahead and probe the cognitive capabilities without being misled by this linguistic fluency. And so the kind of core takeaway is when evaluating large language model capabilities, we should dissociate language from cognition, intelligence, thought, whatever else we're actually trying to measure.
Can we ask questions?
No.
Can we ask questions? Do you hear us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, about this former point that you made, isn't it the case though that when you try to measure intelligence, verbal IQ is actually one of the items that's most correlated with overall IQ, as far as you would accept it as a form of good measure of intelligence? So what does that tell you about your former point?
Yeah, so let's see. So it depends, and I put cognition / intelligence / thought because these definitions are fluid. And so it's kind of up to us to determine what it is that we are trying to establish. And let me get into the next section of the talk, and then after that, we'll see if your question still holds. I think I'll try to make that distinction a little bit cleaner in the next section.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll come back to the IQ question in a moment. Okay, so what I want to do today is first talk about one way in which we are proposing we can try to dissociate language from the rest of cognition, and that's using the notion of formal and functional linguistic competence. So that's hopefully going to help to clear up different components of intelligence and IQ that you might be interested in. And then we're going to talk about one specific domain of functional competence, which is generalized world knowledge, which is a domain that I think is very interesting, even though that's actually where language and cognition do end up getting blurred a little bit. And then, depending on the time, we can talk about some of the do's and don'ts of LLM evaluations. How can we actually go beyond and test these models very carefully because they're very good at trickiness. Okay, so why am I saying that language and intelligence, other cognitive capacities, should be dissociable in our evaluations? That idea is actually coming from my training as a neuroscientist, because in the brain, language processing actually takes place within its own separate network. So this is a set of brain regions, usually in the left hemisphere in most people, that are dedicated to language processing at different levels, words, phrases, sentences. They are responsible for listening and reading, so different forms of language comprehension, as well as for speaking and writing, so different kinds of language production. They respond to languages across many different languages from different language families. So here you see the language regions and different people speaking those different languages. And an important thing is that these areas are selective for language. So if you measure how strongly they respond to language during production or comprehension, you'll see strong, robust responses. But for other cognitive tasks that don't rely on language, you'll see very low responses. And that includes math, logical reasoning, problem solving, different kinds of conceptual knowledge, etc. So we see the selectivity for language versus other cognitive tasks. And then this evidence from brain imaging, where we can measure how strongly an area responds, is complemented with evidence from the clinic, evidence from people who might have had damage to that part of the brain. So sometimes a stroke can take out a huge chunk of the brain. So these are a very extreme set of examples. So most of the left hemisphere is missing, and that kind of lesion will result in what is called global aphasia. So people have trouble with language production, language comprehension. But if that lesion primarily targeted language areas, we actually can see that other cognitive capacities might be spared. So these people can still solve math problems. Some of them play chess on the weekends. So we see lots of pretty sophisticated cognitive functions preserved, even in the absence of language. And so we can see that language processing in the brain seems to be primarily targeting this set of areas that we call the language network. But that said, the language network doesn't operate on its own. This core language knowledge is useful only insofar as we can integrate with everything else that we know, that we can reason about, that we want in order to use linguistic information in our everyday life. So we might combine this information with our social knowledge, knowledge about other people, situation modeling, keeping track of different people, different objects over time, maybe as you're listening to people talking or watching a movie. Different kinds of world knowledge, including knowledge that you've acquired through your senses, like vision. A network responsible for general cognitive tasks like problem solving, math, logical reasoning, and a set of regions that we're investigating that might be involved in semantic tasks more specifically. And so what we think is happening is that there is constant dialogue between the core language network and all of these other systems in order to make use of linguistic information to accomplish goals in the world. So now that we have this picture, we can start asking more specific questions about each of these boxes. We can say, okay, but what do they look like in the brain? What do they look like in artificial systems? Are they distinct? Do they talk to one another? What does it look like? And so we can draw a distinction between, on one hand, formal competence, so language-specific capabilities that in humans are processed by the language-brain network, and functional competence. Because these capabilities are not language specific. You can think about what other people want when talking to them or when just observing them without the use of language. So non-language specific capabilities that you nonetheless need in order to use language intelligently to achieve things in the world. And so it turns out, and to give an example of formal competence is something like the keys to the cabinet are on the table. So R needs to be plural to match keys here and not singular to match cabinet. Y, these are the rules of English grammar. So that's an example of formal competence. And it turns out that this is actually quite easy for language models starting with GPT-2 or 3. And when you interact with ChatGPT today, you rarely see it make grammatical mistakes, at least not in English, the language in which it has plenty of training data. And it's actually a remarkable breakthrough. We haven't had models that can produce grammatical fluent language for decades. People have been trying to do that. So it's really, people kind of forget, all the papers I showed you are all about can these models think, but their language capabilities are very impressive. And in fact, that's not something that linguists were expecting for a long time. It was assumed that you have to have built-in linguistic knowledge for it to work at all. And now it turns out you don't have to. The model can actually learn from the data. And on the other hand, we have functional competence. So something like 6 birds were sitting on a tree, 3 flew away, but then 1 came back. There are now 4 birds. So knowing that you have to put 4 here requires knowing words for numbers, but also doing some basic math and plugging in accordingly. So math is functional competence. And it turned out that that's something that's more challenging. ChatGPT today, of course, will solve this problem just fine. But as you start increasing the numbers or adding more steps in that problem, that's where you start seeing model performance kind of go up and down. Often, even if they do succeed, they might succeed for the wrong reasons. The performance might rely on memorization. It's simply seen this example or a similar example before. And we've actually seen that in order to overcome this hurdle, there have been architectural modifications to these models, shifting away from simple next word prediction to fine-tuning, either self-fine-tuning or reinforcement learning-based approaches, or even incorporating additional modules, similar to how the brain has different modules that specialize for these different kinds of tasks. So we see that functional competence is really the challenge that is being solved by AI right now, through a variety of diverse approaches. Okay, so now verbal intelligence versus fluent intelligence. So it depends on what we are trying to measure here, right? So knowledge of specific words, vocabulary knowledge, that in our framework is an example of formal competence. And say solving IQ problems like Raven's matrices, that's more on the functional competence side. So we do think that this distinction is there. We think it's real. We think it's real in the brain, and different brain systems would observe these different functions. In fact, there is clinical evidence from people with brain lesions that shows that if you impair part of the brain responsible for logical reasoning, mathematical reasoning, that it's specifically the fluent intelligence that gets impaired in these people. But if the language network is damaged, you don't see the similar kind of IQ drop. So we do see the specialization pretty cleanly in the brain. Does that answer the IQ question? Are there follow-ups?
Yeah, I guess the more broad question is to which extent in human cognition, intelligence deploys and develop throughout the language interface. Because it seems like it's hard to think that it's not the case at all, that even the logic, completely fluid part of intelligence can develop as well with someone who has problems, really impaired language functions. But maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
It's a very important distinction. The evidence I showed you from people with aphasia, people with brain lesions, these are people who got this damage as adults, right? So they already had fully developed linguistic processing, logical processing, then they get the lesion. So it turns out in this fully developed brain, when you have impairments to language processing, logic stays intact or mostly intact. Right, so we see the separation. But development is a separate story. How does the information get into the brain? How can it be structured so that those logical systems can develop? And so there, it seems like there is much more of a relationship between language and other cognitive capacities, because language is the medium by which that information can even get inside the brain. And so if it cannot get inside the brain, then it cannot scaffold all of these other cognitive capacities. And in fact, we see that for social reasoning as well. Children who were born deaf and have delayed access to language, so they need the hearing aids or learning sign language in which they can master just fine. But if deafness wasn't detected in time, oftentimes they might go without language for a while. And so if that happens, oftentimes they also have social reasoning impairments, theory of mind impairments, suggesting that you really need language to understand other people better. So there is that relationship in development. There is also something in the chat, if I can pull it up. Let me see. All right, the question is if you are bilingual or multilingual, okay, that can be interpreted both ways. Okay, so what happens if you speak multiple languages? So if you are listening to a language that you know, then the language network will get engaged. If you're listening to a language that you don't know, the language network will not get engaged, is the rough answer. If you are listening to a language that you know a little bit, then you might have the language involvement and the domain general task network involvement, the multiple demand network. So essentially, if you don't understand the language, then the language network will not be active.
Спасибо.
Okay. Let me go this. Yeah, so I've done this kind of in a hand wavy way, but I think that's actually going to be helpful to the show since we've been talking about this. So this is an example. So this is the language network that we've been talking about, and then this is the network that I've been referring to that is responsible for domain general reasoning, math, logic. It's called the multiple demand network because it is recruited for a pretty broad variety of tasks, including, say, computer coding. And so if you see a problem like the bird problem, what we think happens, this information flows into your brain. It is processed by the language network. The language network extracts the meaning, but it cannot do math. And so what it does, it passes the information over to the multiple demand network. The multiple demand network performs the relevant computation and then returns it back to the language network that then generates the answer for. So that's the idea. Again, in a fully formed brain, this is the kind of division of labor. And so, damage to either of these two networks will impair this process, but for different reasons, right? Decoding the output versus performing the relevant computation. And in models today, we don't see the structure, at least not explicitly, right? We don't see these explicit modules. A lot of the time, it's this kind of end-to-end computation that these models are trying to perform. And, you might ask the question, does it matter? Maybe, this problem can be solved in many different ways. So why do we care how the human brain is organized? Well, I think that most of the time, actually, internal mechanism will affect behavior. In principle, you can, of course, imagine two different mechanisms resulting in the exact same behavior across a wide range of inputs. But the chances of that happening aren't very high, especially if the task is complex. So if the task landscape is complex, then the probability of different mechanisms resulting in the same output is pretty low. And so that's why we see examples like this. It's a little old. Do people know what Project Euler is? It's a set of pretty challenging, really challenging problems for math and computer science. And so it's 1,000 problems or a little under, and the first 100, the solutions are all openly available. But for the rest of them, the organizers have asked to not release the problems openly on the web, but of course it's leaked, and kind of the lower the number of the problem, the higher chance that the solution has been leaked somewhere. And so this is one of the early GPT models' performance on these models. And so you can actually see that for the first couple hundred problems, well, the first 100 problems, performance is really great. And then the higher the problem ID, the lower the probability that it will kind of answer the problem correctly. We have like accidental exceptions here, but presumably this pattern is explained by the fact that it just saw these leaked solutions in its training data and then can essentially give you the answer, not because it's using a very different strategy from what a human would do to solve these tasks. So that's something we always have to keep in mind with these models. Do they do it in a different way than a human? And if so, does it matter? Will it affect the way they behave in ways that are relevant to us? Okay, so kind of the general takeaway is that functional competence lags behind formal competence. Formal competence is very important for getting information in and out, and functional competence is where a lot of the meat is. And these are all capabilities that are no longer language specific. So even though these models are called language models, we know that, we kind of expect them to do much more than just language proper. We want to use language in clever ways. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the more specifics and more of the nitty-gritty by talking about world knowledge. I'm going to talk about why it's kind of complicated, I think more complicated than for math to separate it out from language. We're going to talk about knowledge of events, the benchmark we built called Elements of World Knowledge, and looking at bias in these models when it comes to answering questions about the world. So why is it complicated to separate language and world knowledge? Well, simply because language contains a lot of information about the world. So of course, we have all of Wikipedia, we have all of those all of the information online, which contains factual knowledge, like Paris is the capital of France, or even general statements like birds lay eggs. But there is more. There is also implicit distributional information that models can extract by tracking statistical regularities in the text. So sentences like the sky is blue today, the sky was pitch black, the sky is pink can all be processed by the model to extract a probabilistic representation of what likely colors of the sky might be. And so this kind of distributional implicit knowledge that we're going to be focusing on today. Let me see what I want. here. Okay, so this information is there, it's powerful, but it's biased. So language isn't used to passively describe everything that we see in the world. When I started talking to you today, I didn't say, this morning my alarm rang, I woke up, I brushed my teeth, I got dressed. I'm talking to you about things that are interesting and important and meaningful. And so this phenomenon is known as reporter bias. We skip information that's not important. And so you can see that actually in a simple Google search, if you Google square wheels versus round wheels, you actually get more results for square wheels because, well, why would you need to specify that wheels are round? And so, a model trained simply on the text information might have inaccurate information about what shape wheels typically are. So an open question about how much learning from language alone, statistical learning, can tell you about the world because that information is incomplete and biased. So one simple example is generalized event knowledge. These are templates of common events observed in the world. The fox chased the rabbit is a normal common event. The rabbit chased the fox. It can happen, it's a little rare, but not impossible. And then the fox chased the planet is something totally outlandish. And so what you can ask is, does this generalized event knowledge rely on language processing? Do these two things go hand in hand? And so with my colleague Karina, we asked this question using minimal sentence pairs. So the fox chased the rabbit versus the rabbit chased the fox. What we did back in the day when models weren't very good at prompting, and we have since replicated this result with prompting as well. But you can essentially give these sentences to the model, and these models are probabilistic, so you can calculate the probability of each sentence under the model. And so you can then compare those scores, and what we expect, the plausible sentence, the fox chased the rabbit, should have a higher score than the implausible sentence, the rabbit chased the fox. So if that's true, the model got it right, gets an accuracy of 1. If that's false, the model gets an accuracy of 0. And then we'll repeat it for a bunch of different sentence pairs. If we do that, we can look at the results. We can look at the results for different kinds of sentences. So this example is animate-inanimate interactions, like the teacher bought the laptop. If you flip it, the laptop bought the teacher. It's impossible, at least in the kind of basic traditional reading. And so it turns out that, if you look at human performance, they are perfect. They know which sentence is plausible, which one is not. And language models, even kind of some of the smaller ones, are actually quite good. They almost match human performance. And even these very basic language models, not LLMs, this baseline that we had, even they do above chance, suggesting that language has a really strong signal. The input has a strong signal about possible versus impossible events. We can also look at animate-animate interactions. The fox chased the rabbit versus the rabbit chased the fox. The rabbit chased the fox is unlikely, but not impossible. And so we actually see that performance here drops. Large language models are close to humans, but not as good as in the impossible case. And then baselines are pretty much at a near chance. And so we see this difference in performance, which we call the gap between the impossible and the unlikely. Impossible sentence is easy to detect, unlikely, not quite as easy. And so one way that we can interpret this is say, well, why are impossible sentences easy to spot? Maybe it's because the laptop bought already elicits a violation in our brain because bought is a verb that has to have an animate subject. Laptop is inanimate. It's called the selectional restriction, this animacy constraint in the subject. And so maybe it's part of the formal competence. Whereas here, the rabbit chased is okay, chased the fox is okay. There isn't like a strict linguistic signal saying something is wrong here. And so we have to rely on graded event knowledge to determine that the sentence is less likely. And so maybe that graded knowledge is more in the purview of functional competence. So that's how we're trying to separate out these capabilities, even in the case where it's pretty hard to do so. And then, we have more power to do useful things. So we can look at syntactic generalization. The author finished the novel versus the novel was finished by the author. We see that the correlation between the active and the passive version of the same sentence is very high in humans, 0.96, which makes sense. The meaning hasn't changed. And in fact, it's quite high in these models as well. So we see that models actually have learned that active and passive voice doesn't matter, which again speaks to their formal competence. They have no trouble switching between active and passive voice. We also looked at semantic generalization. The author finished the novel versus the writer completed the book. It's not the same thing, but it's pretty similar. And so we actually see a 0.9 correlation here for these semantically similar sentences in humans. In models, though, that correlation is lower. It's there, it's significant, but it's not nearly as high as in humans, suggesting that semantically, these models actually aren't quite on par with humans, at least again, this iteration that we saw a little earlier in the day. So we can do this really fine-grained manipulations, and we really did like a really deep dive in this paper to really look in detail at these models' representations, what they know, what they don't know. But in short, LLMs systematically distinguish possible and impossible events, but are less consistent with likely versus unlikely events. And so this was just, kind of a pretty narrow case, very basic event sentences. So then we decided to go beyond to a much broader benchmark of different specific kinds of world knowledge that we call elements of world knowledge, or EWOC. That's work done with my colleagues, Alec and Ben, as well as a large team of cognitive scientists and people who really are trying to think about what this world knowledge should entail. We came up with these different domains that we know are important for human cognition. Many of them have dedicated neural systems in the human brain. Within each domain, we have a set of concepts that we think are important that might serve as building blocks for our world models. So as an example, in social relations, we can take a couple of concepts like teacher and student. And then we can construct items that test the model's knowledge of these concepts in context. So we can have the context, Fatima assigns homework to Jose, Fatima is Jose's teacher. Makes sense. Fatima assigns homework to Jose, Fatima is Jose's student. That's a little weird. And then we can flip it. We can say Fatima submits homework to Jose. So now student makes sense and teacher doesn't. And so it's a really fine-grained, controlled benchmark where we change a little bit at a time in the context, in the target, to see, can the model tell the difference? Can the model actually use these concepts in context in consistent, robust ways? And so we tested a bunch of different models and humans on these different domains. Our best domains were social interactions, things like helping and hindering. Humans are perfect, models are not perfect, but pretty good, especially, this like newer batch of models. You can see different dots here. Different dots are actually different versions of our items. Let's say different names, right? Fatima and Jose versus Mary and John. So you actually see that models are sensitive to this little sort of variation, even though, in principle, they shouldn't be. Our worst performing domain was spatial relations. Humans are good, not quite at stealing. It turned out people aren't good at absolute relations like North and South, at least people in the US, in the Western culture. But models are really terrible, right? Models are at chance or a little bit above chance. So we see this huge gap in performance between model and humans. And we can zoom out and look at all domains arranged from best to worst. You see, generally, language models either all perform quite well or perform quite poorly on any given domain. And we see this trend where social interaction, social properties are easiest for models, and then physical relations and spatial relations are actually hardest. Which is interesting because it kind of, agrees with this evidence I mentioned earlier about children with language delays having social delays. So this evidence is kind of the flip side of that, saying, hey, look, language contains a lot of information about the social world. So these models that only see language, they actually learn a ton about the social world and not so much about the physical world around us, which we learn about not through language alone, but also through say vision. So overall, basic world knowledge in large language models varies drastically by domain, with social knowledge outperforming physical and spatial knowledge. And we actually designed EWOC to be extendable. So if you want to test your own domains, your own concepts, it's very amenable to different kinds of extensions. Any questions here? All right. Okay. And so then one more thing we looked at, we just wanted to make sure that the model responds, it actually responds in a way that reflects its internal knowledge. In humans, that's not always the case. Let's say for children, if you ask them a question, they might not answer correctly, even if they know what the answer should be. Maybe, the phrasing of the question was too complicated, it was too long, they got distracted. So, you need to interpret the question, you need to get your knowledge, you need to formulate the response in the right way and then say it. It's a pretty complicated process. Similar for a language model, you need to interpret the prompt, you need to access your internal knowledge and then transfer prediction in the format that is consistent with what the prompt is asking for. So there are all these additional demands associated with the task and extracting knowledge and phrasing it correctly. And so one specific example we looked at is this yes bias that we see in humans. For example, in children, if you ask children a bunch of different questions, they're going to say yes for just everything. Is this for reading? Yes. Is this round? Yes. They'll just say yes. They'll agree with whatever you're saying. And so we wanted to know with my master student, is that the same case for language models? Do we see the same kind of response bias that we see in humans? Does yes bias arise as a result of statistical learning on language inputs? Right? Humans are great statistical learners. Do they just pick up on this kind of, yes answer being really prevalent? So here we measured bias in two data sets of world knowledge, COMS and EWOC. We have additional work extended it to more data sets across a bunch of different models on the x-axis here. So orange is yes bias, blue is no bias, and white is no bias at all. So good behavior. So for the comps data set, we see that, in general, we see yes bias across all models. For EWOC, we see some models with yes bias, some models with no bias. And what's important, the same model can have positive bias on one data set and negative bias on another data set. So overall, we, decided based on this graph that there actually isn't a consistent behavior, isn't a consistent yes bias in these models because it can actually flip based on the data set. So does yes bias arise as a result of statistical learning on language inputs? No, language models are often biased, but the bias direction varies depending on the model, data set, and testing conditions. So the bias is there, it's not human-like. We also ask, does it matter? Does this bias actually mask existing model knowledge such that correcting for this bias will actually improve model performance? So we developed a bias correction method that takes a few questions from the data set estimates the probability of the model generating yes versus no in a class balance setting, and then corrects for that bias. Turns out when you recalibrate the models, you essentially eliminate the bias. This method works really well, very effective at eliminating the bias. And so then, of course, now the question is, does that improve performance? So here we're plotting the bias score on the x-axis and accuracy on the y-axis. Here are the models before bias correction. And then here are the models after bias correction. So first of all, you see all of the models now are near the 0 bias score. And you see that these lines are positively upward sloping, meaning that accuracy does improve. Not a ton, but a little bit. So yes, bias was masking some of that knowledge, but it wasn't perfect. So some knowledge was masked and then some knowledge is still missing. So does the yes bias mask existing model knowledge? Yes, and correcting for the bias typically improves model performance. All right, so this last section is more informal. So maybe I'll go through some examples and then we can keep it more open-ended and more like a dialogue. But what I found in my work in AI world is that it's not only my knowledge of the brain that is helpful to me for understanding these models, it's also just my general background as an experimentalist, right? In order to test these models, we need to design experiments to figure out how they work. So we need to know about things like control conditions. We need to figure out how to create the specific examples that we want to test these models with. And so this experiment, how to analyze the results, how to account for confounds. So this kind of experimental knowledge is very helpful. And so at some point I put together this list of do's and don'ts based on this basic kind of experimental background and also from reviewing papers that came out really early, when there was this big boom in AI analysis that people were very excited and didn't necessarily have all the controls in place. And so I think it's really interesting and it's a really interesting challenge. How do you evaluate what the models know? Because we can't assume that they're doing it in the same way as humans do, right? And so one of the do's, for example, is determine what the model might have learned about your test during training. Well, I've already shown it to you, so we might as well go through this example. So you might know this problem, or this riddle. A father and son are in a car crash that kills the dad. The son is rushed to the hospital. Just as he's about to go under the knife, the surgeon says, "I can't operate. That boy's my son. Explain." And the kind of most common response is that the surgeon is the son's mother. And ChatGPT gets it and explains that always the assumption that a surgeon is typically male, blah, 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 blah. So it's a kind of a gender stereotype problem. And then, we can modify the problem saying, hey, no, we know that the surgeon is male. And if we see that this problem, which was not part of the training set of the model, makes ChatGPT fail, this says, the surgeon is the boy's mother. The puzzle relies on the assumption that the surgeon must be male, which can lead people to overlook the possibility that the surgeon could be a woman, even though the prompt explicitly states that the surgeon is male. So this is a prime example of ChatGPT seemingly knowing the answer, but this is simply because that was part of the training data, and in this case, deviating from the training data leads to issues. Does somebody want to come up with an alternative explanation for this riddle? What, might be an explanation for the situation with our response modified?
I think we all know. And that's probably most of us thought about it. I think we all know. We thought about the cheating surgeon.
I actually haven't heard this response before, funnily enough.
Really? No,
Yeah, no, yeah. There are actually a few. There is a family with two dads. There is some version of, biological father versus adoptive father. So I guess not quite in the cheating context, but in like a readoption context. But yeah, so there are a few different options here, right? And so yeah, people can kind of come up with a few different options, and ChatGPT could not. So, and it's a real issue. For Ewok, we thought so hard, how can we protect our items from being exposed to the training set? We don't make them available in plain text. We release them in this password protected way. We have the user accept the terms that saying, hey, please don't reshare our data in plain text. It's probably going to leak sooner or later. But yeah, it's very hard to design evaluations that the model has not seen before. And as soon as they're out, they might end up being fed back into the model. It's a big issue. The model can have alternative strategies to arrive at the correct answer. This horse is called Hans. It's Clever Hans. And it's interesting because actually it's a pretty common metaphor in AI now. But in my experience, students have not actually heard about it necessarily. Clever Hans was a horse that could do math in Germany about 100 years back. Turns out it wasn't actually doing math. It was reading the body cues of the owner. So, it would say 3 plus 5, and then the horse would tap 8 times, and around the 8th time, the owner, I guess, would tense up, and the horse was able to pick up on that and stop tapping. Potentially even kind of inadvertently by the owner. And so models might be doing the same thing. They might be picking up on cues that we didn't know are there. And so that's why item design is so important. When the items are simple and controlled, you know exactly what you're changing, and you know exactly why the model might be responding in one way or the other. But if you have this like long, complex piece of text, the model, like the horse, might be picking up on all kinds of random cues that we humans don't pick up on. But the model might answer for the wrong reasons. And so, here the teacher bought the laptop versus the laptop bought the teacher. The Clever Hans solution, as I mentioned, was laptop bought is a bigram that just doesn't happen in text nearly as often as teacher bought. So in our own work, we have to be aware that, hey, that might be a kind of dumb solution that models have come up with in order to solve the problem. And then, how do we solve it? Well, incorporate careful control conditions. So, even though this example suffers from the problem of bigrams, what's good about it is that the words are the same, right? Teacher bought laptop, laptop bought teacher. So we know it's not something about the frequency of individual words that's driving the answer. So that word content is preserved. In Ewok, words are not preserved, but we are changing one word at a time in order to change the answer. So Fatima presents Jose with useful information. Fatima is helping Jose. Fatima presents Jose with misleading information. Fatima is deceiving Jose. So surgical changes to change the outcome. And then let me maybe do just one more. Okay. Do not assume that LLM responses reflect universal human behavior. So that's kind of big because we have, claims like, can AI language models replace human participants, right? And then and there has been work in that vein even recently, where you have a model, an AI model that's supposed to predict how a human would respond to a particular problem, a particular prompt. It's very tempting. You don't have to spend all that money testing actual humans. You can just test the model and have it give you an answer. But the problem is which humans. And so it turns out that actually, if you ask a language model like GPT, questions from, say, the World Values Survey, questions that have different kinds of, moral scenarios, the model predicts United States humans very well Same with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But if you go to cultures that are different from English-speaking Western world cultures, you actually see that the model's responses are less similar to responses of people from these countries. And so these models.
Yeah, a question from the back. I can't read the slide closely. Could you explain the axes and what these boxes are?
Yes, so the x-axis is cultural distance from the.
Yeah.
The x-axis is cultural distance from the US. So 0 is the US, and then so it's some kind of normalized scale of how culturally different the country is. The y-axis is the correlation between model responses and human responses. So over here, and each dot is a country, responses of people from a particular country aggregated on the World Values Survey. And so we see here that countries with low cultural distance from the US have high correlation between how a human would respond to this question versus how a model would respond to this question.
Thanks.
And then countries that are culturally different, then model responses are different from how people from these countries would respond. And there is some further work on that. If you, what happens if you ask in that country's language? Turns out language doesn't actually matter too much. But if you customize a prompt to say you are a person from X country, then the model is better. Like the model can adapt a little bit to mimic a respondent from a particular demographic or a particular country. But it's a big, but yeah, so essentially we have this tendency to say, oh, human behavior is universal in psychology and neuroscience already, and then, you know, it might end up being exaggerated in this AI psychology land. And then, you know, finally, don't jump to conclusions. There's a lot of hype around these models. So, you know, there are claims like, you know, theory of mind might have emerged in large language models as of, you know, 23, like as soon as ChatGPT came out. And then there was follow-up work saying, oh, is it actually clever hunts? You know, is the model actually just mimicking the pattern that of the theory of mind problems that it's seen? Does it actually understand social intentions of others? And so then the original work has been revised to a much more tame title, Evaluating Large Language Model in Theory of Mind Tasks. And so, you know, of course, it's this claim and not this claim that ended up in the press. And so it's just useful to not be subject to hype as much as we can. All right, so overall, don't conflate language and thought. One way to do it is by distinguishing between formal competence, which is knowledge of linguistic rules and patterns, functional competence, non-language specific skills required for real-life language use. This distinction is grounded in neuroscience, helps to clarify the discourse around large language models, and develop targeted assessments of their capabilities. So with that, I would like to thank my lab, my mentors and collaborators, and you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anya. Any questions for a couple of minutes?
This is a really interesting talk. Some of the things we guessed, I think the Waterloo group is especially working on space representation and actual representations to add on. What do you also have solutions? What we can do to get better models using now these LLMs?
Yeah,
Or
I have.
do you suggest add-ons? Should we just add things?
Yeah, so we talk in our paper, Dissociating Language and Thought, about some of the potential kind of modifications. So, I mean, the main one is modularity, right? The brain is modular. It has different specialized regions and networks for different functions. So it would make sense for AI systems to be modular as well. And so one solution is architectural modularity. So take an LLM, take another module, put them together, maybe train them separately. And of course, you know, that's being done already, pairing an LLM with a code execution platform or a language model and a vision model. So these are some examples of architectural modularity. But there is another kind of modularity that's less explored, which is emergent modularity. So can we create conditions for these modules to spontaneously develop within the model? Well, it has, like, people do that kind of work, but usually in smaller models, small recurrent models, stuff like that, right? But at a large scale, can we encourage this kind of modularization? Topographic models is something that I've been involved in a little bit that kind of also try to do something like that. So can we, not predefine those modules in advance because we know that these approaches are often brittle? Can we lead these modules to emerge pretty organically? And so, the idea being that if the model is brain-like in its structure, then the behavior will also be human-like.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other question? Toby?
Can you, thanks for showing about this EWOC. Is this, EWOC is, I didn't quite understand it. EWOC a platform for comparing language models?
EWOC is a data set that can be extended. So I don't have this, but yeah. So essentially, if you
I mean, does it have a large number of pre-built tests that you can run on a particular language model? How would you use it, say, in a workshop like this?
Yes. So first of all, we have a website, so you can find more details there. So it is a data set that can be used as a benchmark. So you can run a bunch of models on this data set, compare their performance, and see which models do better, do worse. One thing we haven't done, so I guess I'm giving away an idea here, is to test multimodal models. Are they better at visual and spatial reasoning and knowledge of these kinds of concepts? It's very possible, right? Or maybe it's not actually about the input or just the input. Maybe it's something about the relational structure is just not being captured by current architectures. So we don't know. We don't know whether that's the input or something about the model's internal processing mechanisms. And then, what I said about kind of building on EWOC is that you can, in principle, add your own test examples and use this same kind of template-based structure, domain concept examples that test each concept for testing other things, like temporal knowledge, for example, is not there, but could in principle be added.
So it's a data set that has a large number of prompts and correct responses, or?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm happy to chat more if anybody wants to try it out.
Thanks.